Today's session relates to why sustainable, that's economical, environmental, social businesses are critical for the conversation on new economy and a just sustainable future. And today we have Erinch Sahan here to talk us through this and give us his points on that. I'll just say two things about Erinch. He works at the Doughnut Economic Action Lab, which is DEAL, where he leads. I was just to get he leads the business enterprise team at DEAL. I think, Erinch, we agreed that you would talk a little more about yourself and who you are and your history and things like that. So I'll basically just pass it over to you, and we will enjoy the next half hour of critical, radical points of view. I'm assuming. So I'm definitely looking forward to this, and I hope the rest of you are too. So yeah, with that, Erinch, it's yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really pleasure to be with you. And thank you, Hannah and Matthias, for inviting me. I'm going to assume some of you have heard maybe of what Doughnut Economics is. Maybe the term sounds familiar. Maybe for some of you, you were a bit hungry and you came to talk about pastry. I'm going to disappoint that latter half, because we're going to talk about economics, and we're going to talk about the one donut that is actually good for us, which is the donuts of planetary boundaries and social foundations that I will be introducing. I've got some slides. I've got about 30 minutes that I will use to talk through them, if that's okay with everybody. But I really look forward to the discussion. I really look forward to a bit of an exchange of ideas, and more importantly, how do we make this big change happen? So, Doughnut Design for Business, that's what the title is. But firstly, a little bit about myself, as Hannah mentioned. I actually come originally from the world of business, and I worked a while in different kinds of companies before moving into the aid and development space, working in Indonesia, particularly on smallholder farmers. And after that, I went to Oxfam. I was there for 7 years, leading various kinds of initiatives based in Oxford. But working around the world for different sorts of campaigning and programs. Before, most recently, I was the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization, where I tried to create some changes in the fair trade movement so that we can get to a more transformative space. But some of those ideas will inform what you hear from me. And most recently, I've moved on to work on Doughnut Economics. Now, Doughnut Economics is an idea, but also a community. It's a community that is growing, that is expanding, that is widening. You can see what it is through the website at the bottom of that slide, doughuteconomics.org, or through various social media as well. But essentially, we're starting to see a lot of action around Doughnut Economics, including in cities, in places that want to transform themselves, whether it's individual neighborhoods or entire cities or regions around the world. And an emerging number of change makers are joining around the world as well to try to take these ideas and say, let's remake and rethink what is possible. Let's leave behind 20th century old-fashioned economics, and let's bring a new model to the world. And we're also beginning to see a lot of tools and resources that are coming into the Doughnut Economics Action Lab community. So I want to share some of those with you so that you can get a bit of a sense that there is a place to connect with the ideas you're going to hear about, and we hope that it resonates with you and it's helpful in your work as well. But first, let's move to how the 21st century began and why we are talking about Doughnut Economics. Most of you will remember 2008 was the year of financial meltdown as the global financial crisis hit. And we've seen increasing climate breakdowns. We've seen increasing protest crackdowns around the world as people trying to defend the rights of nature are increasingly hit hard by those that don't want the change to happen, that will protect Earth and our living systems, to the COVID lockdowns, which have also demonstrated what happens in terms of disease and virus when we encroach into the natural space. So from meltdown to breakdown to crackdown to lockdown, been a century of crisis. And in response to this, what we propose is a donut that can be a compass for human prosperity. The outside of the donut is the ecological ceiling. These are the 9 Earth system the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have developed, that they warn us we must not transgress. This is a delicate balance that we have on our planet between these Earth systems, and we need to make sure that we are living within the boundaries of our planet. On the inside, there is the Sustainable Development Goals, but the social side of the Sustainable Development Goals, which remind us that we also need life's essentials. We cannot contract our economies to a point where we no longer have enough food and water and energy and life's essentials for everybody on it. When we put those two observations together, we get 2 concentric circles, an outer ceiling and an inner foundation, and it is in between these two boundaries that lies a safe and just space for humanity. Now, this idea, this concept, has been embraced by many and has been useful to change the conversation, change the narrative about what's possible, what's needed in the economic narratives around the world. And we've seen a lot of organizations, leaders, people that are driving action in different directions take on the possibilities of rediscovering a new economic idea through Doughnut Economics and through the allies and other related movements like well-being economy that are showing that actually we don't need to be stuck with last century's economic ideas. So how are we doing? This is the donut, but how is the planet doing? Unfortunately, we're not doing very well. We are both in overshoot on most or majority of our boundaries. And by the way, chemical pollution is also in excess of its planetary boundary. And we are in shortfall for hundreds of millions of people around the planet for life's essentials. This picture looks the same, whether you are in any developed economy around the world or any high income economy, and it also doesn't look good in lower income economies. So if we look at the US or UK or China, and indeed, if you look at Denmark or Sweden or Norway or any other country in the world that is deemed higher income, what you see is a pattern that the way we meet life's essentials for most of the people in these countries is by hugely overusing the fair share of the planet's resources. The other side of the spectrum is countries in the global south are not using their fair share. They're using much less than their fair share, but are actually in even greater shortfall on life's essentials for people on it. So we can swap over countries as we like, and we will see a similar picture. And that picture is that there are no developed economies. There is nothing developed about a country that has reached higher income by overusing and depleting the life supporting systems of our planet. It means that we're all developing countries now, and we need to think about ourselves in that light, that every country needs a significant transformation in order to live within the ecological ceiling while meeting the basic needs of its people. So what does this mean in practice? What is leading us to this level of both overshoot and shortfall? Well, let's begin by observing the degenerative model of taking from Mother Nature, making things, using things, and losing things, and repeating this over and over again. That has become the centerpiece of our economic model, our international trading system, and our models of business, as well as consumption. This is something that our grandchildren will look back on us one day and say, did you know this? Did you know we were behaving in this way? And what did you do to try to reverse it? We're beginning to see some solutions. We're beginning to see that there are those that are reversing this, and they're reversing it from that degenerative model of running down Earth's life supporting systems to a regenerative model of working with and within the cycles of the living world. That regenerative model essentially is taking its inspiration from all the ideas that are connected to concepts like circular economy, as well as biomimicry, ideas and concepts that mean that we can actually design out waste, and we can look to nature as well for inspiration on how we design not just our products, but our systems. What this looks like in practice is a bit of a journey. For a long time, we talked about sustainability, like sustainability is the final goal. So for instance, this has been framed often as being about getting to minimum damage, minimizing or even eliminating the damage we do to the natural world. For instance, by getting to zero deforestation, or getting to a point where we create some waste, but we recycle our waste. But that's no longer sufficient. We cannot just get to zero deforestation because we've done so much damage that we need to restore and regenerate the landscapes that we've damaged. At the same time, we just getting to 100% recyclable is no longer sufficient. We actually need to design out waste. We need to repair. We need repairable products that have modular product design, for instance, ones that can last much longer and minimize and eventually eliminate waste altogether. These are the ideas of being regenerative, of working with and within the cycles of the living world that we believe that business especially can be a part of driving if it is designed itself in the correct way. Then we look at the other side, because of course it's not just ecology. We need to look at social side of things together as well. And there's a huge level of awareness now about how divisive our economies are, how much inequality it has driven, that there's been a capturing of opportunity and value in the hands of too few people. The recent report that came out around Davos, where from my former employer and Hannah's, Oxfam, reminded us just a huge amount of wealth inequality has been created, that the vast majority of new wealth created has gone to the richest 1% over the last couple of years. So how do we reverse this from a divisive, high inequality fueling economy to a distributive economy that is sharing opportunity and value much more equitably with all who co-create it? Well, some ideas here again about going beyond just the goal of being inclusive. We don't want to just get to a goal where people, for instance, meet their living wage. We need to go beyond living wage. Living wage is about getting to the bare essentials. It's very difficult in some contexts already. But how do we get to a point where we design businesses and companies that are sharing the profits and the upside of the value that they are creating? For instance, on the right there is the large employee-owned company, Waitrose and John Lewis, who together share their profits back with their workers at the end of the year. Of course, this goes beyond just sharing value directly, because there is an aspect of hyper competition that has also gone into markets and leads to things like aggressively enforcing patents. And we need to move away from that and towards ideas like open source design that we're starting to see in the technology industry and beyond. So these are some of the ideas. They're happening in the business world already, whether it is modular product design, whether it is open source design, whether it is companies that are employee owned and are sharing at least a part of their profits back with their workforce, going beyond the living wage. But what is the overall goal? Well, what we're beginning to see is that there is an opportunity to move more companies into this domain. And that involves a few steps. The first step that we've been creating and working with companies around the world on this is we need to envision what it looks like to belong to that future economy. And here I sort of invite you as well to close your eyes and imagine that future economy. Imagine one where we have designed away waste, we have designed away pollution, we have got to a point where there is far more equality and far more distributive models of business and economics out there, together, both ecological and social, working in tandem. Well, if you were to think of a business and when you visualize that thriving future economy and you think that that business can belong to it, then you start asking questions, right, okay, if that's the future economy and that this business needs to belong to it, what has the business started doing and what has it stopped doing in order to belong to that future economy? We also then start to ask, well, how could you get bigger ideas from people like activists, from colleagues, from technical experts, from industry leaders? And businesses start to populate these ideas together. They start writing down some ideas like, yes, I want to, get this social equality far higher in my company. I want to reduce my carbon footprint. I want to get to, much less waste. And then we bring in the next step and we start asking, okay, but those are your ideas and those are the ideas you can imagine. What if you were imagining talking to other voices? What about your local employees and your communities and your customers? If they were in the room right now, what would they be suggesting? And you start hearing bigger ideas, you start hearing bolder ideas, and you start thinking, let's go one step deeper. What about the workers and the farmers in the supply chain? What if they had a voice in this company right now? what would they be asking for? What would they be saying that the company needs to become? And slightly some bigger ideas come, because very few companies can actually bring the voices of the workers of their supply chain into their decision making. Then we go to the next level and think, okay, well, what about the forests and the rivers, the air and the soil, the living planet? What if the planet had a voice here? What would it look like? And then you start to get even bigger ideas, and you ask about future generations, people that haven't been born yet, your great-great-grandchildren. If you're talking to them right now, you're a CEO of a company, and you need to take these big ideas forward, what would they make of the ideas you're coming up with? What would they say you should do differently? And critically, what would they make of your excuses for not doing them yet? And through this, what we developed, and we worked with over 300 companies the last year to go through a process of this, is what we developed is some companies can do this and other companies can't. And if you divide the world into those companies that are stuck in being degenerative and divisive in the way that I described, or regenerative and distributive in also the way that I described, we start to see the companies that are held back have got a particular aspect and features that hold them back. It's the outdated processes that they have, the rigid financial targets, often limiting what is possible for them, the short-term thinking and a culture of hierarchy. Whereas the ones that are taking forward the biggest ideas, what they're doing is they're suspending practicality. They're not saying, look, I'm not sure if this is commercially viable yet. I don't know exactly if the technology can be implemented, or I don't quite know how to make the business model work. Well, they suspend practicality. They say, look, it might not be possible yet, but let's put the big idea on the table. Let's keep exploring. How could this happen? When could this happen? They also bring in other perspectives of ideas and thought leaders across different kinds of stakeholder groups. They bring in longer term thinking, and they encourage difficult and challenging ideas from their colleagues across the board. They have this culture of courage. And what that means is that they're the ones that are able to pursue things. So all of this points to the fact that there's a particular design within businesses that enables certain kinds of actions and strategies to be taken forward, and that sometimes prevents certain actions and strategies taking forward. Now, I want to pause for a second and take a step back here and also start thinking about, well, what does this look like in reality? Now, over the last year, we've met a lot of business leaders in very senior positions who told us stories. I'm going to give you 3 of them. One of them told us that, look, we prototyped an expandable shoe. It was going to be profitable, but it wouldn't have hit our usual margins, so we dropped that idea. This was an executive from a very large company that you have all heard of. I can't say the name, unfortunately, but what he found was that despite the fact that this was going to be new business for the company, they're going to reach low-income people who otherwise do not afford their footwear and their shoes, who would then be buying expandable shoes that are much more ecologically friendly. And the parents only buy a single shoe at a young age, and over time that shoe expands, so they don't have to buy new shoes every year. It's much more ergonomic for the children, and at the same time it was going to be profitable, but it wasn't profitable enough. They wanted, if they're going to make money, they're going to invest in something, in an idea, in a process, it needs to be a higher level. That idea got dropped. We met another senior executive that said we should introduce refillable perfume bottles, so take out single-use products, but bringing consumers on board needs investment, and the payback period on that capital expenditure is too long, so therefore they didn't do it. This was a leading company that made a big net zero commitment, but they couldn't quite make the actions necessary because of the way they calculate investment in the company, the way they calculate capital expenditure in a company. Another senior executive told us that I've been asked to create a range of regenerative clothing while being expected to deliver the usual 15% profit margins from the outset. This is impossible. Over and over again, we come across these companies that are held back, that aren't able to pursue the ideas that they would like, or individuals in those companies would like, because of their structure, because of their design. And as we look through this, we realize this is not a huge surprise. If we look at the way that many NGOs are designed, commons or communities or public services, there isn't an inherent barrier. There are other barriers, there are other challenges in those organizational designs that make it difficult sometimes. But there isn't an inherent barrier the same way there is sometimes in business. because business is designed to maximize margins, maximize dividends, and they can only do regenerative and distributive things if it also is able to pursue maximum margins and maximum dividends. So then the question comes up, why not redesign it? Why not? Why do we accept this design? There could be very viable and commercially successful models of business that already exist that can unlock those ideas that every day are being generated in businesses but get left on the table. And we need to place this, I think, with other models of change, other theories of change, and how it relates to it, because we're very able to envision the fact that actually there are so many different examples. I'm sorry for the slight error there on my slide set. I realize that there was text there unnecessarily, but there are many other ways of driving change. So there are approaches around exerting public pressure, around getting consumer voice or worker organizing, or having investors and their voice be stronger, or having regulations and governments taking stronger action to change the way businesses behave. This is critical. This is pivotal. There's also a lot of efforts to create enlightened leadership among companies, or to be much more effective in setting targets and metrics and measuring impact much more effectively. There's a whole bunch of initiatives around making the business case to try to demonstrate that actually you will make more money long-term if you just did these regenerative ideas or distributive ideas. But to reinforce all of these and to drive an even further ambition, what Doughnut Economics focuses on is transforming the deep design of business. So if we have businesses that are also designed to pursue these goals, they will work more effectively with the regulations. They won't try to get around those regulations. They will get out of the way of enlightened leaders, that they will much more authentically and in a committed manner set and measure and pursue goals and metrics. And they won't need to have a high bar for the business case to take action. All of these things become unlocked if we can also have a design of business that is leaning in the same direction. So how do we do this? How do we explore these ideas? And over the next 7 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a bit of a journey through what we call the framework of deep design. We took these ideas, worked closely with the author and theorist Marjorie Kelly, whose work inspired our work of looking at a company through its purpose, its networks, its governance, its ownership, and its finance. And essentially, it's about moving away from that 20th century question that is at the heart and baked into the center and core of business, which is how much value can we extract through this enterprise? I mean, if you've worked in a company, I have worked with many companies, I've worked within many companies, that is the underlying question that decides, can I take this action or can I not take this action? Can I make this investment or can I not? Can I pursue this strategy or can I not? Is, will it help me extract more value from this enterprise? And how do we move away from that old-fashioned question that dictates too much of business and move towards the newer model of business, which is based around how many benefits can we generate through this enterprise? Now, as the statistician George Box once said, all theories are wrong, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And we hope that this is a useful way to explore the deep design of companies. So let's begin with purpose. And this is really about asking, why does this business exist? Does it need to exist? And what purpose does it serve in this world? Critically, a lot of companies are writing down these purposes. They've got wonderful consultants coming up with great sentences that are got beautiful words. But where it makes really sense is looking at the operations of the company. Is that purpose manifested in the operations? Is it manifested in the products and the services and the supply chains of a company? Take here on the left, a regular company in a fast fashion industry. The industry requires it to minimize its costs, make things as cheap as possible, as quickly as possible, and as fast as often as possible. And all of this means that it is within a straitjacket of a business model. That means its purpose cannot go outside of this. Whereas if you look at a company like Manos del Uruguay in Uruguay, which is a business that is owned by 12 different women's producer cooperatives spread across the country. It's a multi-million-dollar company that has existed since 1968, making high quality products from natural fibers around the world. And what is fascinating about them is that their central purpose has never changed because of the way that they are owned, the way that they are governed. It makes what is possible for them much more broad, much more focused on its core purpose. Then we move to networks. And here it's about asking the question about the relationships the business has with its customers, its suppliers, its staff, its governments, its communities, its partners. Are those relationships ones that are commodified, that are competitive, that are trying to minimize costs and maximize revenue and minimize risks for themselves? Or is it a collaborative model of partnership, like the example of El Puente, which is a business based in Germany? They import food and garment products and homewares from around the world, distribute across Northern Europe. What is interesting about El Puente, I got to know this when I was leading the World Fair Trade Organization during the COVID-19 pandemic, was that when the rest of the broader industry was trying to renegotiate contracts, cut prices, and reduce their commitments, they did the opposite. They doubled down on their supply chain. They doubled down on committing to their producer groups, the cooperatives, the social enterprises that were producing their products. They provided additional financial flexibility and additional commitments to them. Now that happened because El Puente has got on its board representatives from its supply chain. It's got on its board representatives from its employees, representatives from communities. It's got a multi-stakeholder board and a multi-stakeholder ownership that makes it possible for this company to pursue its social and ecological mission. It's not just about the supply chain, of course, because there are companies in services industries, there are other aspects of a company. Of course, it's about tax avoidance and moving away from that towards paying your fair share of tax, and as well as being a part of progressive lobby groups and organizations that are pushing for more action from government, more effective regulations, rather than groups and networks of businesses that regressively lobby, that try to hold back ambition and hold back action, particularly from government and regulators. Then we move to governance. How is the business governed? What are the voices in decision-making? Who are the voices in decision-making? What are the rules and culture of a company? How is success measured, and how open is the company in terms of its transparency? Here it's about governance being in service of finance. Moving away from the governance being in service of finance to it being in service of a broader purpose. The example given here is a company from Wales called River Simple. Now, River Simple is a hydrogen car company, but if you go to the board of River Simple, what you'll find is that there are all sorts of stakeholders represented there, including the environment, including the users of the products, including staff and investors. It's got it's a board that is comprised of people where they call the model a future guardianship model of governance that represents different kinds of stakeholders that are impacted. There are other organizations doing similar things. The brand Faith in Nature has just put nature on its board. So it's given a voting board seat to the organization Lawyers for Nature that will represent the rights of nature on the board of Faith in Nature as a company. These are models that are available to any company. Why a company would not have nature on their board is probably now a question we need to ask every company, because that is a core part of the considerations that should be central. Then we move to ownership. Who owns the business? Is it the old-fashioned extractive ownership models of venture capital or stock markets or private equity that really limit what's possible? Or is it generative ownership models? And here we give the example of Patagonia. Now, Patagonia took on a model that I think is going to feel very familiar to you in Denmark, because it's steward ownership. And of course, many of the very large, older companies in Denmark have got some kind of a foundation ownership model. What I thought was fascinating about what Patagonia did that took inspiration from the long-standing Danish model of steward ownership is it created two separate share classes. It created one share class that is owned by the foundation, but that share class has got all of the voting rights, but has none of the dividend rights. So they can control the company, but they never get the money from it. And they have no incentive to push the company to make more money. It just needs to make sufficient money. On the other side, they have an NGO that gets all of the profits of the company. But the NGO doesn't have actually any voting rights over the company. It means that it has no ability to put more pressure on the company. It gets whatever is left over after the company is focused on its purpose. Now, if you're a decision maker in Patagonia, that just shifts the realities for you. Suddenly, you don't have the same pressure to increase profits, to increase dividends, because of the way the ownership has separated money and power. So those are some of the innovations happening. And of course, there's employee ownership, there's community ownership models, there's hybrid models, there's platform cooperative models. There's all sorts of emerging new ideas of how we can own companies and how that then affects the governance priorities of it. And lastly, we move to finance. And this is about the relationship that companies have with the financial parameters that shape its decisions. Where does finance come from? What does it demand? What are the expectations on margins, on dividends that enable or inhibit the company from pursuing certain ideas? And what's considered a fair return for investors? And how does profit get allocated and reinvested? These are all questions that are live. These are decisions we make about the design of a company. And essentially, is finance serving financial returns, or is it serving a purpose? The example that comes up here, again, is one that I worked on in my last months in the World Fair Trade Organization, is between the Body Shop and Plastics for Change, where the Body Shop, through its community trade program, was able to pursue a partnership to get the world's first large-scale plastic recycling, which means that the waste pickers in India were treated with the same dignity that you would expect from a fair trade product anywhere. Now, what was interesting about this is what allowed the Body Shop to do it is that they gave a level of flexibility in terms of margins and other conceptual frameworks of value that allowed decision makers to have much more patience, much more commitment to make that idea possible. So, to summarize, redesigning a business has got loads of benefits, but it's got benefits to the business long term, but as well as to society and ecology. It could mean that you end up aligning the internal processes of a company with the purpose of a company. For instance, having product design processes aligned with the purpose. You can enable partnerships, deeper partnerships, and engage stakeholders through the supply chain. You can make sure that you have much more investment into transformative ideas, and as well as making sure that the legacy and the mission of the company is protected longer term, holding it in a higher level when there is a threat from hostile takeovers, for instance. Most importantly, it is because it enables regenerative and distributive ideas to come to life and become regenerative and distributive by design. Now, if any of these ideas have resonated with you, we actually have a tool that we created through our work over the last year that is open for use for organizations that are values aligned with any business that they work with as well. And it allows them to have a workshop of 4 to 5 hours to explore the ideas of Doughnut Economics with businesses, business leaders, and those that influence business. And that sort of goes through a process of mapping the impacts of a company, trying to bring out and draw out those regenerative, distributive ideas and ambitions that we talked about earlier, looking at how the design of a business enables those ideas or holds back those ideas, and then looking at, well, how would you redesign a business in order to pursue those ideas before having a bit of a summary of that journey. And we created that with more than 22 pilot workshop series with 300 businesses and through organizations around the world that have begun to use this tool. And it's very much open to being used by all sorts of organizations that work with companies, with businesses, and some of them that are registered to use the tool are on our website there. So if you are interested, do go to doughuteconomics.org, and you can find our tool and the policy on there through the website. That's at the bottom of that slide. So I will end there, but that is the overall question that is both in the tool, but also what Doughnut Economics poses to the business world. How do we go through a process of redesigning business through its purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance, and ask ourselves a question: how does the design of a business block transformative action, and how could a redesign of business unlock transformative action? I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Erinch, for this great presentation with lots of thought-provoking things and questions to ask oneself. See, there's one question in the chat, but and just as, yeah, I see there's some applauding around in the on the screens there. So thank you very much. So there's I was maybe I'll chip in myself and then start off with some of the questions that just kind of popped into my mind. Like you were talking about how it's difficult. Like, are there some things that are particularly difficult or some particular challenges? I mean, I think the financial side of it is what often comes to mind, thinking, okay, you have to make a profit. So that seems to be one of them, but are there other things? And then some of the other ones I was just thinking about, like, okay, so if it's so difficult to transform older firms, like you were talking about sort of the more traditional ones, do we need startups? Do we need different types of firms from the outset? Or is it possible now, it's exactly what you're working with, of course, but how do we transition more traditional companies into thinking and acting in a different way? And then it was really interesting on how to bring voices of workers, not on the company, but further down the line. How do you bring some of these voices into your boards from your suppliers, for example, further down the supply chain? Anyway, I have lots of questions, and also on like, can we make this a structural change instead of like pinpointing companies? Or anyway, but I'll stop my string of questions here, because the great thing is that we have a whole bunch coming into the chat box as well. And Erinch, I don't know whether you want to whether I'll just read a few more up and then you can see if you can answer them as we go. And then please keep your questions coming, everyone. And if you want to ask a question on the microphone, please do just raise your hand and chip in. The first one in the chat is from Blas. He says, what are your opinions on effective altruism and its role in a major multinational company? And then there's one from Felix who says, how can the change you're envisioning be enacted? And this is primarily on an individual, organizational, or social level. So maybe along some of the thinking that I was thinking as well. And then I see you've entered you've put in the link in the chat. So and anybody curious to this, open up the chat box if you're not looking at it already, and you can look at that. Anyway, back to you, Erinch. Lots of questions. This is great.
Thank you, Hannah. Well, you've put some great ones, and I can see the ones from the chat are wonderful as well. So I'll try to bite off a few of them because some of them overlap and are quite connected. But in terms of, I agree. I mean, there are huge challenges to doing this, because for the last 100 years, we were told business exists to grow its profits to the maximum amount. And when it gets to this amount, it needs to get more. And when it gets to this amount, it needs to get more. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is, I mean, I've worked within large companies as well. Nothing is ever enough. And it's, you know, nobody's saying companies should not make a profit. A company that's not making a profit doesn't exist. It goes bankrupt. So it's not about profit or not profit. It's about maximum profit, which becomes an end in itself, and it becomes the decision-making tool, and it becomes this dividend extracting machine that keeps growing dividends every year. Every quarter grows its returns. Every year grows and that's constantly trying to do that. Versus a company that says, okay, how do I get to a viable amount? And I can be a healthy company, I can thrive, but I can make sure that I am focused on the social and ecological goals. And I met one individual in India, a guy called Matthew John, who leads and started a social enterprise called Last Forest. And Matthew became a friend. He's someone I spoke to, but I remember when I first met him, I thought, what an amazing business. You and your community live around the forest. You harvest certain things from the forest without damaging it. And you create sort of, you know, honey, and you create other soap products, and you do some weaving with natural fibers. Fantastic. What a sustainable live. Now let's scale you. Let's make you bigger. And he said to me, Erinch, like, this is the right size for this business. It shouldn't be bigger. It shouldn't be increasing its profits. This is actually sustainable. This should be replicable. You know, you should replicate this somewhere else. Rather than make me 100 times bigger, make 100 of me somewhere else. And I thought there was this awareness of what is the right size. You know, this is such a strange question in the way we design business. It's such a strange question to ask, what is the right size? Don't get bigger than this. This is the right amount actually that is in balance with your ecological and social realities around you. And also it allows you to replicate what happens in nature. If you look at nature, a tree doesn't try to become, you know, one tree becoming the entire Amazon. Actually, it lives in balance. It figures out what is the right balance with each other. And I think that same thinking can inspire what we are pursuing. So how do we redesign business away from this growth agenda of grow profits, grow profits, grow profits, to one where it is healthy and viable and thriving, but focused on social and ecological benefits. Systemic change came up, absolutely. I mean, the way I think we need to get to systemic change here is, A, we need regulatory reform so that we start to have laws that at least get to the basics of what's needed. But also those laws should be shaping the kind of businesses that are emerging, you know, rather than have a bunch of very large greed-based kind of companies that are constantly trying to grow as much as possible and then try to regulate them to make them a little bit less bad. Regulation can be much smarter and can deliberately favor conversions. And here we're getting that question of how does the change actually happen? You know, a lot of, just this weekend, Bernie Sanders was in Oxford. So I went to his talk and we asked questions. And in fact, yesterday, my colleague Kate Rayworth was on the radio with him talking about new economic ideas. He was talking about how they created a fund in Vermont to transition businesses into employee ownership, into financing the buyout of companies by their employees. There are tax breaks that enable this to happen, and that make it easier for workers to be owners or co-owners of a business. There are lots of ways we can reshape regulations and laws and financing to make sure that systemically we start changing the kind of businesses that populate our economies. And we can make this change for startups, of course, and have financial opportunities for them to access investment, but also convert existing businesses, especially private companies that are family owned, for instance. You know, they can transform the ownership, especially when the owner retires. Sometimes they want to sell the business, and why not sell it in a way that means that it's going to be owned by the community, whether it's community-owned renewable energy models or community-owned retail shops or community-owned other businesses and structures. All of that is possible, and it could happen to convert existing companies or to create new startups. But I think the biggest danger we sometimes have is we get focused in on the businesses that already exist, and we think, oh, we can't change them. But the companies are constantly changing. You know, every 10 years, you have a different set of companies that are populating the majority of our global economies. 20 years ago, the biggest companies today didn't exist. You know, the biggest companies of Facebook and Google, like, they didn't exist. And today, new ones are being born that will dominate future economies. So we can decide what kind of companies they are. And that's, I think, the point of a lot of this thinking. I mean, there's a few other great questions in there around effective altruism, for instance. And I think the point here is, rather than get companies to be philanthropic, how can we design them so that they exist to create benefit through their own internal models as well? Whether they do this through effective altruism, through anything philanthropic they do, is also helpful. But I think the core question to ask is, how would we redesign businesses to unlock the biggest ideas?
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Erinch. There are a couple more questions. So there's one from Demelius who says, if I understand correctly, Doughnut Economics suggests incremental top-down transformation, where even large companies gradually transform rather than more radical grassroots ways of transformation. One question. Let's take two more here. The next one is from Lucas, who says, we would like to spread the word in Czechia and help businesses and the government to start the redesign. How do we best integrate the tool into our program as a business association? Is there a blueprint of the back end of DEAL? And then finally, one from Nana and Emilia. How do you get investors interested in purpose-driven businesses if they can't expect high financial returns in our neoliberal economic system today?
Wow, 3 fantastic questions. I'll take them in order. So for the first one, I mean, I think what we're proposing is a grassroots transformation model rather than top down. It depends which of the examples you heard from me maybe felt more dominant, because some of the examples, like Manaus de Uruguay, is a very bottom-up company model. It's one where it was built by a bunch of cooperatives. They came together, they expanded their network, they created a business rather than sell to, you know, they're doing weaving, they're doing dyeing of fabrics rather than sell to the international market on very low prices. They said, let's create our own business that we own from the grassroots up, and they made that a success from 1968 onwards. They grew that slowly and organically, and they developed into a more sophisticated model of business. So, and there's a story there about the investment question as well, because not all companies need a huge amount of finance. I mean, if you, especially in some company models like in manufacturing that's more handmade or more organic, actually you could grow organically. You can grow through the business's own development and access other bits of capital that help along the way. It doesn't mean you knock on the door of venture capital and you need 200 million to begin with to have a business that's competitive. I also recognize there are companies that do need a lot of capital at the beginning, and that's a different and more difficult journey, but it's possible for them. But overall, I would say we try to provide this perspective, whether you're going bottom up or top down, whether you're trying to transform the big multinationals of this world. It's much harder to transform them, but I would say there are possibilities, and you can do that through systemic change as well, through changing tax laws, through changing corporations acts, through changing government procurement, through changing national finance institutions that can provide finance for certain kinds of conversions and transitions. But you can also, I think a lot of the change is going to happen grassroots. I think we're going to need to build this alternative and then say, this is the future, guys. Like, policy has to catch up, investment has to redefine itself in order to belong to this new economy that's being created. But a lot of the Doughnut economics work I would classify as grassroots and bottom up, even though we would like to appeal to any kind of organization anywhere. The second question around business associations is fantastic. So we built this tool exactly for organizations like business associations to use. If they want to create a journey for the businesses in their network to come together, have a workshop together. Actually, what's on the website, the first link I provided is to the tool, and all the facilitation notes are there. There's a link to a Miro board to do it online. There's a PDF printout to do it in person. There's all the slides, all the examples, all the case studies, all of the guidance for the activities, examples of the activities applied to products or services. So it's designed actually as for a facilitator to take this, spend a bit of time reading through it, and then go, right, okay, I've got the documents, I've got the slides, I've got the PDFs to print, we run a workshop. So it's exactly for that. What we ask is that if you are an organization like that, you register on our website at doughnut-economics.org. I left a link there in organizations in action. And we just make sure that it's values-aligned organizations and facilitators that are doing this, because we want that to be an ambitious journey. We wanted to keep the integrity of it, but it is a document that's in the commons for people to use. So please do use it. That's why we created it. And then the question around investors is incredibly significant and central. I think there is a diverse world of investment out there, more diverse than it looks. There is, of course, some social finance. There's a lot of businesses using crowdfunding for products that give them patient capital for longer amounts of time. There are NGOs and others that run various impact programs that can be effective. Beware that a lot of impact investing isn't very impact focused, is actually focused on very high returns, and it demands a lot from entrepreneurs. I met hundreds of social entrepreneurs over the years that said, hey, I went to impact investors and they told me they want the same return, the same conditions as regular finance. They just said, I have to do extra work and give them also impact reporting. And it can be an extra burden for the way some people in that space are, but it's a spectrum. And there's a part of impact investing that also does actually have patient capital, more impact focused capital that wants sufficient returns, not market rate returns, for instance. But of course, we need to reshape the financial sector, because if we accept it as it is, we're not going to make the changes necessary. And I think a part of this journey is to demonstrate, look, these other businesses, these other enterprise designs are possible. And look, we're starting to see some new investment models that make it actually also possible to support and invest in them. Now, government, let's come up with the policy innovations that will make this experiment into the norm, and will make this the centerpiece of the future economic ideas and reality. So that's sort of our approach, but we accept it isn't easy. to go and raise 200 million in order to run a business like this. But at the same time, it is possible to get meaningful investment. It's also possible to negotiate with investors a bit differently and say, look, I want nature on my board. Okay, I am going to give the investors a significant say and power, and I am going to deliver some fair returns as well, but I want some other things. So depending on how strong your position is as a business to negotiate as well, we're beginning to see new ways of reshaping that relationship between investment and a social enterprise, for instance.
Thank you very much, Erinch. There's another question in the chat from Oscar, who says, how can consumers' informed choice affect this transition? Are certificates and standards a way forward?
A great question, Oscar. It's difficult because I think the conversation around the information given to consumers is a little bit outdated. The certifications that exist are not talking about these big transformational ideas. I mean, some of this exists in, you know, in newer ideas or emerging ideas, but I think we're still at the beginning of defining this in clear enough terms that you can make a very black and white judgment for consumers. The certifications I see that are existing out there are helpful, but they're not quite transformative. And there are some businesses that use those certifications and standards without necessarily having the highest regard. Now, I say this as someone who used to run an organization in that world of certifications and standards, and I recognize the difficulties, because the ones that are doing it more authentically and more radically are very hard it's very hard for them to appeal to major big corporations, and they remain small. And the ones that are appealing to the very large corporations are having to make some compromises. And I think there's a debate about, is that a right compromise, or is it too much of a compromise that undermines the reality of what they were pursuing? You know, I won't get into that, but all I would say is that we need to inform consumers about deep design of business, about who owns the business, where did the profits go of this business, what is the governance, who's on the board of this business, what has power. Those are the questions that we need to have as centerpieces. I think people can understand those questions, but for too long we talked about, oh, is this product ethical or not ethical, and is this business got some right policies or not those policies. We got into very technical conversations rather than let's get deeper to the structure of the company. How is power structured in that company? How is money distributed in that company? And when we get to that level of conversation, then I think we can reshape consumers. But at the moment, I think step one is awareness raising around the possibilities around new organizational and enterprise designs.
Thanks a lot. That was like, okay, I wonder if that sort of thing changes, would we then see less tax planning and all of that stuff if you have like organizations change the way they are owned, etc.? Or will there still be companies trying to get out of paying taxes?
Well, Hannah, I've actually got a great answer for you today, because this morning I met with the founder of a business called Lush. Now, if you've heard of Lush, it's one of the largest businesses in the world that is committed to the fair tax mark. And it's very unusual for a larger business to commit to fair tax, because every other company says, I minimize my tax. That's why, in fact, I have to minimize my tax. The founder of this business has worked very hard to make sure that the design of the business enables him and the family and the owners to make these kinds of decisions. One of the things that he's done is increase employee ownership. And he's given 10% currently into employee ownership, and is growing up to at least 40%. And the employee ownership trust that holds those shares, they have a veto right over how the business can be sold. So the business can never be bought by another individual and controlled by another individual that will force it to maximize profits. Part of the reason is its commitment on ecological issues in its supply chain, as well as its employment opportunities, but of course its stance on tax as well. So there is a link there between the fact that he was able to protect the business. If he had a venture capital investor that came and took the majority of control of the board, he couldn't do fair tax. They wouldn't allow it. They'll say, you're leaving money on the table. Like, this is my money, I want more. Nothing is ever enough. But he's delivered a particular model that has meant that The ownership will always be purpose-led, and employee ownership of the business will keep rising over time as they start to sell aspects of the company as the business evolves.
Thanks for that. And interesting and happy to know. And then, of course, it's also interesting how different business models work in different countries, where I think in the British and American systems, companies are more obliged to ensure that profits are maximized, whereas there's a little more leeway for companies in Denmark, for example. Anyway, but that's a whole different discussion on tax and stuff like that, which is another favorite. Anyway, we're just about at the hour. So I was wondering if anybody has any last questions before we sort of wrap up. I don't see any more in the chat. Any last questions? No? In which case, I'd just like to thank Erinch for your great presentation and all the questions and answers from everybody, all your great questions. It makes for a great dialogue. So thank you very much for that, and yeah, and for chipping in and joining in and yeah, being part of a, to me, super interesting conversation. Yeah, so with that, I guess we will end today's session. I was supposed to say about the next one is on Tuesday, the 7th of March, with Cyril Obi on petrocapitalism and the consequences of oil extraction for communities in Africa. Yeah, so I hope to see lots of you there. With that, just a huge thank you to everybody, and thanks a million for the presentation, Erinch. Super interesting.
Thank you all.
Thank you.